What's going on in Washington?
On the brink in more ways than one.
Ike's name in the primaries, but does it mean anything?
The farm problem, a tug of war.
Fracas around the foot soldier.
From Washington, NBC presents transcribed Keys to the Capitol, a weekly news program in which the National Broadcasting Company's top Washington reporters and commentators discuss with you the news of the week and what's behind it. Tonight you will hear Robert McCormick, Ray Scher, Arthur Berrio, and Herb Catlow. NBC News has given these men the weekly assignment of going through Washington's official doors to learn the background of our national policies. We bring you now Keys to the Capitol. First, here's NBC's Robert McCormick.
Well, I want to talk today about what almost every politician, I guess almost anywhere in the world, is talking about, and that, of course, is Secretary Dulles' brink of war statement in the interview published in Life magazine. I think we'd be making a mistake if we considered the uproar over this particular episode only a matter of domestic politics. It's a matter of world concern and not simply a local issue. One of the best demonstrations of this is the reaction in the British press. Now, the British press certainly is not a model of reliability and thoughtfulness, but the very fact that it's interested shows that the backwash of Dulles' statement goes way beyond the political limits of the United States. What it all boils down to, it would seem to me, perhaps, is that it tends to confirm the suspicion that has been growing rapidly in many countries that the United States policy of containment of communism has now turned into a policy of almost aggression, and that we are so cocky that we don't care how close we come to war. If this policy had actually been phenomenally successful, the tough old diplomats around here might regard it as a radical new development in international relations. But as a matter of fact, we lost our cause in Indochina, and here again the implications, if not the facts, attributed to Dulles in the Life interview are open to question. I covered the Big Four foreign ministers meeting at Geneva that made the decision to divide Indochina, and before the meeting opened, we let it be known that we positively would not agree to a partition of the country. Yet the ultimate decision was not ours, it was France's. So when it became inevitable, as most of us knew it would be right from the beginning, we had to accept it, and at the time we just looked silly. And in Korea, well, that's another intriguing story. But Dulles says we averted war by our firm and swift action. Maybe we did, who knows, because we certainly didn't get into a war. But equally certainly, our foreign policy has scored very few positive victories so far as the layman can see, at least in recent months. What do you think of it?
Bob, I'd just like to ask you one thing since you came back from Europe. What was it, about 6 months ago? Mr. Dulles personifies American foreign policy, I think, to the foreigner. Has there been any resentment toward him as personification of that policy before this incident?
Well, yes, I think there was. He was, I'm going to sound a little ruder than I mean to, but he was kidded more than anything else. He was, ridiculed's too strong a word, but he was lampooned for this Indochina business, as we were so positive in our statements before the Big Four foreign ministers meeting opened that we absolutely would not agree to a partition of the country, when everybody else knew that we had no alternative if France, and certainly if she was backed by the other two principal allies, we just couldn't do anything else about it. So the statement was foolish from the start, and then, of course, when we had to come along and agree to it, not enthusiastically, well, then we just looked a little bit silly. So it wasn't actually a resentment. It was more, lampooning.
Bob, don't you think that Mr. Dulles, through his action and through his statements, made the Reds believe that we would not accept a peace at any price proposition, or that we weren't bluffing? And that's why they backed down finally.
Back down where?
Well, I mean, we have no war. I think in this particular
Well, where did they back down?
Well, Indochina for one thing.
Oh, they didn't
You've got
back down
a
there.
division. You've got a division there.
Well, that's what they
but
started out to
you got
get.
no further. Yeah, but you have no further movement south.
Oh, you've got an infiltration. It's got the South Indochina elections that are supposed to be coming up in a complete turmoil. That's what the communists wanted.
I think the most striking thing about this whole article is this Indochina situation. Dulles was so scared of the whole thing that we refused to sign it. We left the conference, and the article comes out and saying that it was Dulles' strength that made such a good thing out of it.
Well, that's precisely what I'm trying to say.
Well, if you want to move away for a moment just from Indochina to someplace like Korea and the offshore islands off the Chinese mainland, this is not my feeling, but it's the expression you get from the State Department that the policy of deterrence is what has prevented the Chinese communists from moving southward again in Korea and from invading Quemoy and Matsu. Now, that's their position. How do you feel about that?
Well, to me, that's one of the most intriguing thing about Dulles' news conference yesterday, when the reporters tried to... He said that it had become known, didn't he, about a year ago that we would protect Quemoy and Matsu.
There was that great back and forth and questioning at the conference.
Yes, but the impression he left was, and the Life magazine article said it rather positively, that a year ago we decided we would protect these two islands. Well, in the congressional debate authorizing President Eisenhower to protect Formosa, it was, everybody was, all the administration people were very careful never to say that we would protect Quemoy and Matsu. And as I recall, Dulles said in his news conference that the communists knew what our intentions were. Well, that's very interesting to me because certainly the Americans didn't know.
That's another point about the article. Twice the impression is given that we would have been ready to use atomic retaliation. That we were ready, that the decision had actually been made. Well, if you talk to our allies and to our congressmen, they were never told that. And that seems to be what sticks in their craw, most of them.
Well, apparently the Reds believed it. I think the Reds would have moved even more than they have into Korea.
Well, there again, that's another thing. The Secretary says we averted war. How do we know that the Reds were going to start a war? I mean, that... how do we know that they were going to do the things that they didn't do? In Indochina, I'm convinced they never intended to go a bit farther than they did.
In some fairness to the Secretary, he, at one point in the article says that nobody knows that this is what has averted these wars, but he thinks so.
Well, the Secretary did say he was given too much credit. Yes.
I think it can be generally agreed upon that this article, from Mr. Dulles' standpoint, as published, was quite a serious mistake.
Well, and yet in his news conference, he did not actually repudiate the article.
No, but he didn't repudiate the article, but he didn't change his basic position, this policy of deterrence, but he did express it a little more clearly, and so it wouldn't be received as the original one in the article was received, the brink of war statement, the necessary art.
Well, do you think it was a mistake on Dulles' part, or do you think he was a victim perhaps of some oversimplification?
No,
I think myself, and I think that in this particular instance, I think he's also the victim in this city of a lot of journalistic jealousy.
Well, now, Life magazine says that they did submit the article to the State Department, was reviewed by Dulles Aid. Now, I worked on a magazine for years myself, and you have all kinds of time to prepare something like that. It's not like doing a last-minute broadcast, and I can't see why there should have been what the Secretary calls ambiguities in anything on which you have that much time to work.
I sort of lean to blaming the State Department more than the magazine for this thing, because when the State Department has to say good morning, it sometimes takes a week to get them to clear it, something of relatively minor importance. And here they're discussing, it was a bad figure.
We certainly can't blame the magazine, because we'd all be willing to.
No, but what I mean is that they clear every minor thing. They seem to be very careful about how they phrase it. And then it comes up to something like this, and it's quite careless.
I cannot help but think this was not a result of carelessness at all, that the uproar over it wasn't anticipated, which to me shows a naivete in international diplomacy that's most appalling. I think almost any newspaper man could have read the piece over and said, holy smoke, this is going to cause all kinds of trouble. But apparently it was cleared by our professional, in quotes, diplomats.
Well, I rather suspect they're gun-shy now and that it won't happen again.
That's what they said about the Yalta papers.
Yes.
What do you think about the political ramifications of this thing? You think it's going to last, run into the election?
I think it will bounce, because I don't think the American people are particularly happy at the prospect of having a ring through their noses and being led to the brink of war every now and then. Now, there's the ambiguity, of course, that the Secretary was talking about. He says we were brought to the brink of war, but, of course, the British make the point that the British newspapers have that certainly their people wouldn't like the idea that periodically they are being brought to the brink of war on the basis of a foreign policy the good results of which have not really been fully demonstrated.
Well, Bob, do you think there's going to be an analysis of the fine details about whether we were brought to the brink of war or whether we went there ourselves?
No.
Or in the final analysis, I think, as far as the voters are concerned, they're going to say, well, there's no shooting war, we're at peace, so the policy must have been all right.
Well, on the other hand, they might, that one phrase is liable to stick, this brink of war business, and they're liable to say, leave us not get on any more brinks of war than we have to.
Get on a few brinks of peace.
Yeah, brinks of peace.
Well, gentlemen, I have a notion we'll be talking about this next week at this time, so why don't we try something else? That's what Mr. Dulles said yesterday after 25 minutes at the news conference. I'm going to try it here. Around the White House, we're still working on the same riddle we talked about on this program last week. Will the president decide not to run again? I say decide not to because most of the pressures on him are to run for the second term. And the decision he might have to make, it seems to me, is largely a negative one, not to run. It seems to me to come down to this. If the president has already taken his heart attack as a warning and has decided not to run, he could announce it right now, today. But he will not do so. One reason, he might lose some of his grip on Congress. Second, it might lessen chances for the men around Eisenhower to control the political situation between now and the Republican convention. If he has any intention of perhaps running again, he cannot make up his mind until after the middle of February, when he hears from the doctors and they tell him what the strain of this month in office has done to his heart, if anything at all. Meantime, the president's name is going into 3 primaries: Minnesota, Illinois, and New Hampshire. Do you think the fact that the White House is not objecting to this means anything as far as the second-term decision is concerned, Art Berrioff?
No, I don't, Ray. I think the whole thing... Well, let me preface it by saying this. I have been listening to Republicans. Well, I was up at Gettysburg, and you were up there, and you know what went on. All these Republicans came out and said he's going to run, he's not... No, they all said he's going to run. I didn't hear anybody say he wouldn't run. They're all whistling in the dark. I think everything hinges on these physical exams. If there's been no great damage or to the heart in this past month, if he thinks he can do it again, that the strain will not be too great, then he might decide to do it. I think right now he hasn't made up his mind.
Well, on the physical exams, I've heard every one of Dr. White's news conferences. There have been, 4 or 5 of them so far. And everyone has been quite encouraging, and it seems to me there's no reason to think that he won't get a good physical exam in the middle of February. Of course, the doctor says he's not going to tell the president what to do. The president must make up his own mind on that. But I think if we take the past as any sort of guide, the physical exam will be a rosy one.
I'd like to ask you people something. Say, I was struck in, I hate to keep getting back this thing, but in this Dulles magazine article...
we go again.
Well, he said that the 3 important decisions actually had to be made by the president, and that he made them. And just yesterday, I believe it was, Adlai Stevenson asked that the president repudiate this whole article. And on the Hill, we have all these investigations going on now, some of which make the administration look just a little sour. And I wondered if this sort of beating that the president is taking through an intermediary at the moment might tend to influence him not to run. That he's getting a taste of just how bad this election year is going to be from the standpoint of personal strain.
You're scraping up against something else I think is fallacious thinking among wishful thinkers who hope he will run, that they can shield him from these decisions. That the decisions that would affect a person's heart are the decisions the president would have to make.
Well, Dulles said specifically the president had to make, it was his ultimate decision, I believe was his exact language.
That's right. They can talk about executive vice presidents and everything else relieving the president. The responsibility is his. I agree with you, Bob. That might be a factor.
And imagine the horror of having to make a decision to bomb with atom bombs the Chinese mainland. Now, my goodness, I certainly would hate to have to be faced with it, and as far as I know, I'm healthy for a newspaper man.
I think these things you mentioned, Bob, are a symptom of what's going to happen in the president's second term. He's going to be immune to much less criticism than he has been. I think he's had the greatest immunity to criticism.
Well, what I was trying to get at was, don't you think that these things are shaping up vividly enough now so he will recognize it and it will be a factor in his decision to run or not to run?
I would think very much so. I mentioned before that if the president has decided not to run, let's assume that just for the sake of my point here, one of the reasons that he can't announce it now is because he might lose some of his grip on Congress. That's what the professionals think. I've never been quite sure of that point. What would you say, Herb?
I would agree with that.
I think that he would?
I think that's the only reason that President doesn't announce as soon as he makes his decision, or holds off an announcement until as late as possible so he can keep his administration in line.
That's right. Mr. Truman held off until, March, wasn't it, when he finally made that
I think it
statement?
has been demonstrated historically, but if you take it now, as of now, for example, if he announced he were not going to run, people like Noland, I think, would be much more active in their areas where they disagree with the Eisenhower administration than they will be so long as he has a tight hold on the party, don't you think?
Yeah.
I've always been a bit dubious, though, that Congress would suddenly turn and go the other way if he said
No,
that
I
he
think
were not-
all it would do would be turn the dissenters in the party, give them more freedom than they have now.
You know, Ray, I think it takes a man with Eisenhower's tremendous popularity to keep this thing going. I think if for any other man in the White House, the public by this time would get a little bit fed up with this. Is he going to or isn't he going to run business, which they're hearing every day? There's so much of it this time. But with him, he seems to be able to ride right along with it.
Well, I don't know. Roosevelt kept him guessing on a third term for months and months and months.
Was it as long as this, Bob? I don't recall.
Yes, my goodness, yes. He told Fred Perkins, was one of the hecklers, asked every news conference whether Roosevelt would run. Fred Perkins of Scripps Howard, and it was just about now the Perkins campaign became so annoying to the president that he told Perkins to put on a dunce cap and go stand in a corner. So by this time, it had already reached sort of a crescendo with Roosevelt, and you wrote it out very easily.
One angle, Ray, I wanted to ask you about this. This is maybe more the oversimplification we talked about in the past, but I guessed on this show a long time ago that he would not run. I was talking to a Republican senator the other day, and I asked him what he thought about it, and he said, I think a lot of my friends are wishful thinkers. He said, one angle to this, he said, the Eisenhowers have poured thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars into that farm up in Gettysburg. Now, he said, that may not be a great deciding factor, but at the same time, he said, they put so much money into it. He said, it doesn't seem to me that they would have gone ahead with all of these plans if they intended to remain here in Washington in the White House at his age.
Well, of course, you can turn that around, Arthur, and say Gettysburg is 3 hours from Washington. You can drive up there for a weekend, and the president can get that needed rest from his duties.
Yeah, I would say that argument works both ways.
Well, let's go on to another one here, boys. There's just as much fun over this farm problem up on the Hill, because if ever there was a political tug-of-war, it's the one going on right now over who's going to do what for the farmer. And who's going to get the credit if and when farm income ever stops declining and hits a rise again. Well, among the Democrats, it seems on the Hill that former President Truman is not alone in his assertion that whatever's good in this new administration farm proposal came from the Democrats, as he said. And, of course, as you know, the Republicans complain that they actually inherited this problem from the Democrats, and they're now catching the blame. Well, be that as it may, this really is one issue, a mighty big one. In fact, at the moment, I don't think there's anything up there any more powerful. And without going into the basic fundamentals of the farm proposals, because frankly I don't pretend to understand them, one can still report this fact, that the administration is worried sick, that it feels that unless there's a quick recuperation of farm prices, all is lost in the fall elections as far as the farmers are concerned. And some Republicans are saying they fear that they'll lose this farm vote, even if Mr. Eisenhower heads the ticket. One Republican senator who asked to remain anonymous told me, he said, you should see the mail I'm getting. He said, there's loads of it every day, and we're getting the blame. He said, we can argue that we inherited the problem, but all the farmers know is that their economy is declining now, and that it's happening under our administration. Another senator up there, another Republican, who tells me he's on the spot, he said if he makes a little speech and mentions, for example, the St. Lawrence Seaway and neglects to say anything about the farm question, all the farmers think he's not interested. And then if he mentions the farm question and forgets St. Lawrence or something else, the industrialists say he doesn't have their interest at heart. And it all boils down to this, as I see it up on the Hill. It seems to be almost as much concern, or Republican concern, over this farm problem as there is about whether the president's going to run again. What's the White House feeling on it, Ray? Is it
Well, the White House feeling is...
big headache over there?
It's a tremendous headache over there. The president has spent more time on his farm program than anything. You remember they had that special session up at Camp David, brought those people all the way up there, spent the whole morning on it, finally got this thing thrashed out. The president's brother Milton has been in on a lot of these things. And their feeling is that this is a long-term thing. You can't fix it in 1 year, and I don't think anybody over there pretends that the farmer is going to get any immediate relief, which is what your congressman seems so concerned about.
Well, Secretary Benson said there would be immediate relief if this soil bank plan were enacted immediately. The farmers could expect some immediate relief by late summer or early fall, which would be just in time.
Yeah, well, that's it.
It's hard to believe that the wheels could turn that fast.
I don't think I'm misquoting this,
No,
Secretary.
that's what he said. He said it twice, matter of fact, said it again last night.
I somehow feel that it would be extremely difficult for the farmers to desert their natural Republican sympathies and vote Democratic. I don't know how far farm prices would have to drop for them to go Democratic. They went Democratic for Roosevelt, I guess, in 36, wasn't it? 32, but those were
Truman.
even more unusual times.
48.
Yeah,
I think they're the first people to
Oh, I do
desert.
too. You start squeezing them around the region of the pocketbook, and they're real quick to hop.
Of course, the farm associations and the big ones have not come out for the other end of the farm recommendations, for the rigid supports. They don't support that. They have been going along somewhat with Benson's plans. The idea of something in between the rigid and flexible support plan.
Well, it seems to me, Arthur, just my casual observation, that everybody likes the soil bank plan, or the Democrats want more of it. There isn't any doubt about something of it going through, is there?
No, I don't think there is, because, as you probably know, the claim on the Hill now is, and perhaps it's the right one, I don't know, that Senator Humphrey proposed a soil bank program some time ago.
Well, Tugwell
And,
actually had it in effect in the early days of the New Deal. Worked very well.
Why, you sound older than we are.
I thought to quote George Washington.
Well, that is, Bob's point is valid. The real genesis of the thing is, if you want to trace it, goes back to the AAA, back to, what,
Yes.
1933?
Sure it does. Well, way back then.
Well, there seems no question about it going through. Of course, the hitch is, can they do something to give relief between now and November? That's that's the crux of the matter. That's where the problem is.
Well, Mr. Martin, the House Republicans had a meeting the other day and came out pretty glum about that possibility, didn't they? They seemed to think that this thing wasn't fast enough, wasn't big enough. Here were some of the people very close to the administration talking in those terms.
Speaking of agriculture, I got to tell my corny story anyhow, the one that's making the rounds now about this whole farm proposal and about how complicated it is. One fellow around town saying, well, he said, it's not complicated at all. He said, you just sit there and study it a while. He said, the only difficulty I have is in distinguishing constantly, he said, between an acre and a peck.
I think a lot of the farmers don't understand, or at least people who live in the farm areas. I was up in South Dakota last summer and sat in with a bunch of people in the heart of an agricultural area. And the people who were talking were not necessarily farmers, but they were certainly immersed in farm situation. My goodness, I heard some of the talk there. Didn't seem to have any recognition or realization of what the real farm problems were. Of course, most of the people did.
Oh, I think actually most of the farmers understand their problems pretty well, a lot better probably than, no, not better than labor does either, come to think of it, because labor is constantly educated by its organizers and things.
Well, I'd like to get on now to another potentially explosive political issue and another magazine article, the one in which General Ridgway...
This is communique by Wiggly, isn't it?
You know about the article, no doubt, is criticizing the administration for the Army manpower cuts, and it looks as though the general, former Army Chief of Staff, will have a chance to sound off before long before congressional committees. Well, what about the Eisenhower administration's position on defense? It seems to me that it's had to reckon with two major important considerations. First, the necessity for a strong defense, and secondly, the budgetary considerations. The Defense Department, of course, makes up the biggest hunk of the budget, just about half. The Eisenhower administration has pointed out time and again that the Russians would probably be happier to beat us economically than on a battlefield. It would be less costly for them. And so some optimum position had to be reached. Well, what they came up with was the idea of a tapered down but streamlined defense setup, the outfits having new and better weapons, the planes flying higher and faster and having more firepower, and the units deployed strategically for the best mobility. Well, the Air Force got top priority, more men, money. The Army got its manpower cut on the basis that that's where the monetary cut could best be afforded. And along with this is the belief that atomic weapons, strategic and otherwise, could help fill in the gaps that in the past would be filled by ground troops, and ground troops would have more effective tactical atomic weapons. Of course, the Democrats, several of them, have come out and have just been waiting for somebody of the stature of General Ridgway to bring up the point again, and now no doubt there will be much said, there already is being much said in criticism of the Eisenhower argument. Just to wind this up for a moment, General Ridgway takes the position quite different than the Eisenhower position. He says our lead in atomic weapons has failed to stop the communist aggression since World War II. He also says that Russia will probably catch up with us sometime around 1958 and 1959. And so there would be a sort of atomic stalemate. And with that, he argues Russia might then go ahead and just use the conventional weapons and use ground troops and get ahead of us that way. He also says this idea of widely deployed troops and mobility that the Eisenhower administration talks about presents uncoordinated detachments that are quite vulnerable. Bob, you look like you have something stirred up in you with these remarks.
Well, I don't really. I was just sort of thinking back that periodically, all during the course of our history, the world history, as different types of military equipment and military planning seem to be becoming obsolescent, the people who happen to be champions of this particular type of military operation always put up a terrific battle to preserve it. I'm not saying that the Army is obsolescent, but I think maybe it's almost entering an obsolescent stage. And I don't blame people like Ridgway for fighting for it. Certainly we never would have won the last war if we hadn't had a lot of troops go in there and just take it on the chin. But looking at it sort of from a Toynbee attitude, if I'm capable of such a thing, it is entirely possible that the foot soldier is becoming obsolescent, and that Ridgway's ire is a little bit stronger than it might otherwise be, because perhaps not consciously he recognizes the fact. I've just been a little bit amused by it. I can't help but go back to the days when the Air Force predicted, of course, that the Navy was totally obsolete before the last war. Well, of course, we never would have licked Japan without the Navy. And so everybody fights for his own unit, his own type of operation. And maybe that's just what Ridgway is doing. I don't make myself very clear.
Well, I think
Toynbee doesn't either.
he puts forth a pretty good argument in this thing about the atomic stalemate, giving the Russians the possibility of moving in their much superior in numbers ground troops.
Well, we're never going to match the Russians in numbers of ground troops anyhow. We couldn't possibly.
You have heard Robert McCormick, Ray Scherer,
we haven't got the
Arthur
population.
Barrio, and Herb Kaplow.
One of the points the administration makes about the size of the Army is that we don't need more soldiers and we can quickly deploy. That plus the economic basis is the central reason why they can take this risk of paring the Army down to its present size.
I think it all boils down to the fact of whether the next war is going to last a week or whether it's going to last a conventional length of time. There are an awful lot of people who think that, for all practical purposes, it's going to be over in a week.
Military strength is supposed to be ready for either contingency.
Yes, I suppose it is, except
Yeah, but
I'd hate to have to be the one to figure it out.
I think wasn't it the president himself who said we simply cannot make provision for every possible contingency, didn't he?
That's right. He feels Mr. Ridgway has what he calls a parochial view.
Well, that you have to decide what your overall strategy and tactics are going to be ahead of time. That you just simply can't. It's entirely possible they might ban gunpowder. We go back to bows and arrows, but certainly we can't train 150,000 archers at this late date.
Think it's going to have any political campaign value, this argument?
Oh, I think all these things have some. You add them all together. Because on the one hand, you have Mr. Dulles saying that we've gone to the brink of war, and on the other hand, you have the general saying, well, at the time we were at the brink of war, we were cutting down our army and lessening our firepower. And you join those two things together, it's a pretty damning indictment. I think Adlai Stevenson made it last night.
You have been listening to Keys to the Capitol, brought to you transcribed by NBC News as a way of taking you behind the doors of official Washington with NBC's top reporters and commentators. Tonight you have heard Robert McCormick, Ray Scherer, Arthur Barrio, and Herb Kaplow. Keys to the Capitol will be brought to you at this same time next week. This is the NBC Radio Network.